This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay. So there are a couple things that we didn't have time to get to on the weekend show. Nothing that I would say, this is kind of a weird period, right? Because at the time between the election, especially after the holidays, and we're just kind of waiting for stuff to start happening. And so it's been a somewhat quiet period, though I think with
a time for reflection.
There you go, a time for reflection. And so one of the things I've been reflecting on is China, and there's reasons for this. Over the Christmas holiday,
we're not just reading the medical literature. I'm reflecting on China.
Oh, obviously, the reason for that is I used to be just like a really pretty significant hypochondriac, and I've gotten over that over the years. But I still am fascinated by medical literature, and so yeah. But anyway, so over the holidays, I had an unexpected expense. I bought a new router. Now, my old router was working just fine, but I saw this news story. It said that investigators in Departments of Commerce, Defense, and Justice had opened investigations into the TP-Link, the big router company, and in fact they were thinking about banning the sale of TP-Link routers in 2025. And I thought, well, do I have a TP-Link router? I don't really think about my router that much. I thought, yep, I did. And in fact, most Americans, I would guess, Jay, don't know a whole lot about their routers, probably never even think about their routers.
I never think about it.
There you go. I had no idea how old mine was, or even the last time it was updated. It's sort of important to update those things for security and other reasons. And it turns out my router was pretty old, and it hadn't had any new updates offered for over 15 months, which apparently when I asked the various LLMs if that was bad, they were like, oh, yeah, that's pretty bad, dude. That's okay. Well, anyway, so I now have a brand new Asus, I guess that's how it's pronounced, router. I'm looking at the box right now because I know it's going to be a pain to set it up, so I haven't gotten around to it yet. But I would rather deal with that inconvenience, assuming at some point I will actually unbox this thing and set it up, than have a router with no security updates for well over a year from a Chinese company that's under the cloud that TP-Link is under. And a lot of folks, I think, whether they know it or not, are in the same situation because they're the market leader for routers in the U.S. with something like, by one account, 2/3 of home and small businesses using one of their routers. Not surprising because they regularly get top ratings from review sites, good performance, low prices. And in fact, those low prices, DOJ investigators think that might violate anti-dumping laws, and that's where a company sells a product at below manufacturing cost to gain market share. Though I got to say, Jay, when I thought about that, I thought, well, I don't think anyone feels any particular brand loyalty to a router. It's not a common purchase, right? So to me, the plan of selling routers below production cost to gain market share, I don't think that really makes a lot of economic sense. I think it probably has more to do with, I would argue, spying and potential cyber warfare than economic gain. Maybe that's a little paranoid on my part. I don't know. But I will point out that this isn't just a router issue. You'll remember, I'm sure, Jay, back in 2019, Huawei was banned from U.S. networks and government networks, right? And of course, then there's the TikTok ban that was passed by Congress last year, set to go into effect on January 19th, just a couple weeks from now, pending the outcome of Supreme Court action. They have there's a First Amendment challenge, and January 10th, they're going to be hearing oral arguments on that. In fact, President Trump's attorneys filed an amicus brief in the case, asking the court to stay the ban until after he takes office. And I read through the amicus brief. It was written by John Sauer, who's Trump's nominee for Solicitor General. At one point, he argues, this is great, President Trump alone possesses the consummate deal-making expertise, the electoral mandate, and the political will to negotiate a resolution to save the platform while addressing the national security concerns expressed by the government. Trump alone can fix it, I guess is the point, which is the fascinating legal argument. I never heard that one before. But I guess my point is all this kind of...
I can defend the legal argument, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I want to get to that. Before we do, though, I mean, do you think I'm being paranoid about Chinese companies using or potentially using networking hardware for state-sponsored hacking or cyber warfare? Or should I have just stuck with my old unupdated TP-Link router? I mean, how would you rate me on the paranoia meter here?
Maybe. I think that's a little high. Well, and part of it, to me, I guess the view of, well, the reason they would be dumping is to, get a spying advantage. I think it's more like there may not be a market loyalty, brand loyalty amongst regular consumers, but in a lot of cases, and I know in my case, I think our router just came with whatever we got from our internet cable company. Yeah. They said, here's the router. So, but I think there is that brand loyalty, perhaps among those big purchasers, right? Your ATs and AT&Ts or T-Mobile or whoever you used. So that gaining the market share there makes a difference, whereas your individual person who just goes out and buys a router.
See, I would argue just the reverse. I would argue that individuals would be more likely to have brand loyalty based on just brand, whereas large buyers, like you said, where most people the company just buys these routers in bulk, makes a deal with the company, that's just going to be price loyalty essentially.
No, because consider this, they also would have the advantage of seeing of how millions of these routers work, right? And if you've got here's the thing with individual consumers, if say 0.05% of them are defective or something like that, it might go unnoticed, right? You might say, oh, I just got a bad one. But if you're a company that's buying them in the hundreds of thousands or millions or whatever, and you realize, oh, we're getting all these consumer complaints, that affects the brand loyalty there because they know, well, geez, last time we went with X company and we had all these issues despite the price. So I think there might be more brand loyalty amongst those big buyers than you'd think.
Interesting. Okay. So
and I suppose there's also like people who are buying their individual routers. There might be sort of a, kind of weird tech bro kind of, sense of, hey, I'm a
Netgear guy, or I'm a whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Like people are Mac guys or they're not, right? So, yeah.
Okay.
I think you might be paranoid in terms of them spying. I don't know how.
I do have a lot of state secrets in my network, so I'm just
and that's also the question then of, well, would that sort of investment be worth the payoff for the Chinese? I could see it maybe in things like Huawei and TikTok, but
speaking of that, so I mean, on the TikTok thing, there's the First Amendment argument here, and I should say that the court is going to consider whether or not they should essentially stay this legislation that Congress passed, right? And again, we've talked about this before. When the courts are considering this, there are a couple things they think about: likelihood of success on the merits, irreparable harm without the stay. And you could say, well, there are something like 170 million U.S. TikTok users and a whole bunch of influencers who make their living on TikTok, or at least, a fair part of their living. Then there's also this balance of equities questions, right? The relative harms to both parties. And then is it in the public interest? And you could argue here that's not necessarily an easy question, because you could say, well, national security, that's in the public interest, but shutting down a massive social network that hundreds of millions or 100 million plus people rely on, well, that's not exactly in the public interest. But I also think, for at least for some jurists, there's maybe a presumption in favor of the status quo. And if a state preserves the status quo. I mean, it should be sort of amongst all jurists.
Yeah, that's sort of the idea, is that you get an injunction to preserve the status quo.
Right. But I guess you could also make an argument that there should be a presumption in favor of democratically arrived at decisions, right? Because this isn't some agency regulation we're talking about here, in which that would be a whole different issue. This is Congress passed it, the president signed it into law. And so I think if you are sort of conservatively minded, non-judicial activist type of person, you might say, well, I'm a little uncomfortable stepping in here if, unless there's really clear grounds for this. But anyway,
there's a strong presumption that a properly enacted law is constitutional. That's sort of, where you start with.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's that. And there is the sense that there are cases that say, listen, if a statute is enjoined, there is some level of irreparable harm to the government, essentially the people, the capital P, who enacted it. That said, if that were the end of the story, then we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights, which is to say, it says sort of, well, except in these circumstances, here's the things that, where Congress shall make no law. So, if they shall make no law dealing with abridging the freedom of speech, then, that you have to take that into account. I don't think you get the presumption doesn't carry you through against particularly, I'd say, an enumerated right.
But and again, this gets kind of further afield, but it seems to me that it's not really banning speech. It's restricting a platform based on ownership. And it's not a,
and I think so, I think you can make the argument, because when we've talked about this, I've said, I think there are grave First Amendment concerns, and a flat out First Amendment type case like this, even though it is just banning the different ownership, I think it's a strict scrutiny question. And almost every, if a law is subject or is to strict scrutiny, it almost always fails, but not always. And I think this might be one of those exceptions where you would say, listen, in this case, there needs to be a tight means ends fit and all this, the least burdensome way to achieve the legitimate government goal. I think there's not a bad argument that this could pass a strict scrutiny First Amendment test.
National security, ground. I guess when I mentioned, not really jokingly, because it's actually part of the brief, right? What do you think about the give Trump time to fix it sort of rationale for? I
think that goes to the public interest prong of it, right? That you can say, look, we acknowledge there's a national security problem, but the public interest is better served by not doing this precipitously and banning it all of a sudden, when we believe there is a potential to get some other resolution that will, allow TikTok to continue to operate but still serve the national security center. So I think is that one of a big slam dunk winning argument? Certainly not. But and to be fair, that's just one small argument. That's just one small part of the brief, but the language just so over the top Trumpian that I felt compelled to mention it. So, but that's the general theme of it, right? Yeah. Is that don't let this happen, or don't do this right now, because Trump can fix it.
Yeah, and so that would be actually a very sort of judicially conservative, non-activist sort of thing. Let's just let this kind of work itself out if we just don't get involved and yeah. But so yeah.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you can say the argument again, and this is a weird kind of thing, because you would say, well, the legal status quo, right? And this is sort of the same argument that's being made in the CTA thing, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but is that, hey, the status quo is the legislation's been passed, enacted, signed, and it takes effect on X day, so we shouldn't upend that status quo.
Right.
again, I think there's the status quo of people enjoying their First Amendment rights, and that's the status quo you also ought to look at. That has to balance into it.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,